Welcome to Apexoraz. This is Elias and Mira. Here, we try to think differently.
In this episode, titled Ideal and Real, How Do We Know the World?, we explore a key idea from Schopenhauer's The Wisdom of Life.
What is real and what is just in our mind? Join us as we dive into philosophy and question the nature of reality.
Follow us on YouTube, Spotify, Instagram, X, and Threads to think differently.
It's a question, many of you have likely pondered. How much of what we experience is actually out there, independent of our minds?
Exactly. Are we perceiving reality as it truly is? Or is our experience kind of shaped, fundamentally, by our inner world? It's a huge puzzle.
Absolutely. And that's precisely what we're digging into today. For centuries, philosophers have wrestled with this core distinction. The ideal, what belongs to our knowledge, our experience, and the real, what exists independently of that knowledge. It's a fascinating journey that takes us from the very foundations of modern philosophy right up to Schopenhauer's unique and, well, as we'll see, quite forceful perspective.
Definitely forceful.
Okay, so to start, where did this whole conversation really gain momentum? Who kicked it off?
Well, the sources correctly identify René Descartes as the father of modern philosophy.
Right.
And a significant reason for this was his emphasis on individual reason, not just relying on tradition.
Okay.
But crucially for our topic, Descartes brought the problem of the ideal and the real into sharp focus.
So Descartes essentially framed the central question. What was his main concern?
Exactly. Descartes zeroed in on how the images, the pictures in our minds, relate to things that might exist independently of us.
Ah, okay.
He questioned, can we truly be certain that an external world even exists? And if it does, do our mental representations accurately reflect its nature?
Wow, big questions.
Huge. This became a driving question for subsequent philosophers trying to understand the boundary and the relationship between the subjective, the ideal, and the objective, the real.
And his famous, I think, therefore I am, how does that connect to this?
Well, that pivotal statement, dubito, cogito, ergo sum.
I do, I think, therefore I am.
Right. It underscores the undeniable certainty of our own subjective awareness. Even if we doubt everything else, the act of doubting itself proves we are a thinking being.
Okay, that makes sense.
And the sources nicely link this to Schopenhauer's assertion, the world is my presentment.
Ah, interesting connection.
Yeah, both, viewed from different angles, highlight the fundamental relationship between the subject us, the knower, and the object, the world we perceive.
So different sides of the same coin.
Sort of, yeah. Schopenhauer's statement emphasizes that our experience mediates our understanding of the object, while Descartes focuses on the immediate certainty of the thinking subject itself.
Got it. So Descartes throws down this gauntlet about the external world. How did he attempt to resolve his own doubt? Did he find an answer?
Well, he famously turned to the concept of a benevolent God.
Okay.
He argued, basically, that a good God wouldn't deceive us about the reality of an external world.
Relying on God to bridge the gap.
Exactly. But, as the sources point out, this reliance on a divine guarantor, well, maybe okay for Descartes, ultimately revealed the profound challenge of the problem itself.
It showed how hard the problem was.
Precisely. It highlighted just how difficult it is to definitively bridge that gap between our internal experience and a supposedly independent external world.
Right, so Descartes gets the ball rolling. Were there any earlier philosophical rumblings about these ideas? Anything before him?
The sources do mention Plotinus, an ancient thinker.
Okay.
He proposed that the soul creates the world as it transitions into time. It's presented as an early hint of idealism, the idea that reality is in some way mind-dependent.
So mind creating reality.
Kinda, yeah. And it even hints at the ideality of time itself, suggesting time might be part of our experience, not some absolute thing out there.
Interesting. So seeds were planted earlier.
Definitely. While Descartes truly crystallized the problem for modern philosophy, earlier thinkers had certainly touched on related concepts.
And after Descartes, it seems like everyone jumped into this ideal versus real debate, right?
Oh, absolutely. The sources then guide us through some of the initial attempts to grapple with this Cartesian dilemma. It's quite revealing, actually, to see the diverse strategies people came up with.
And the limitations they ran into.
Exactly, and the limitations they ultimately faced.
Okay, let's delve into some of those attempts. Malebranche and his occasional causes are mentioned first. What was his perspective? Bit of a strange name.
It is. Malebranche, struggling with how our minds and a separate physical world could possibly interact, proposed a pretty radical solution.
Okay, I'm listening.
He argued that we don't directly interact with the physical world at all. Instead, He posited that we see all things within God.
In God. How does that work?
Well, his idea was that physical events are just occasional causes, triggers, basically. God is the sole active agent, the one actually causing our perceptions and making things happen in sync.
So if I kick a ball, it's not really me causing it to move, but God using my kick as an occasion.
According to Malebranche, yes. The sources draw a connection here to Spinoza's pantheism, where God and nature are one. But essentially, Malebranche tried to explain one mystery mind-matter interaction by invoking an even bigger one, God's constant intervention.
Yeah, that does sound a bit like substituting one unknown for an even greater one. Okay, what about Leibniz and his pre-established harmony? That sounds quite intricate.
Leibniz certainly offered an intricate system. He imagined the universe as being composed of these fundamental units called monads.
Monads.
Yeah, like indivisible points that are simultaneously mathematical, physical, and even have a sort of soul-like quality.
Wow. Okay.
And to solve the mind-body ideal real problem, he proposed this pre-established harmony.
Harmony. How?
Think of it like two perfect clocks, right? Made by a divine clockmaker, perfectly synchronized from the start.
Okay.
They both show the exact same time, minute by minute, second by second, but neither clock actually causes the other one to move. They just run in perfect parallel.
So the mind is one clock, the body or world is the other.
Exactly. Leibniz argued our mental world and the physical world run in perfect parallel because God set it up that way from the beginning. No direct interaction needed.
The sources use an analogy of a stage play, right? With the hidden stage manager.
Yes, that captures it quite well. Everything unfolds perfectly according to the script, but the actors aren't really causing the scene changes.
But the sources also note that this idea was considered, well, pretty strange even back then.
Oh, definitely. The text mentions the monstrous absurdity that his contemporaries like Bale pointed out. It rests on a huge assumption about God's initial setup.
A big leap of faith.
A very big leap.
Yeah.
And as the sources also remind us, Spinoza had actually proposed a similar idea of parallelism earlier.
So Leibniz wasn't even entirely breaking new ground there. All right, let's move on to Spinoza himself. His idea of substance monism is brought up. How did he try to tackle this?
Right, Spinoza. He started with Descartes' dualism mind, or thinking substance and matter, extended substance, meaning stuff that takes up space.
Okay, the two basic ingredients from Descartes.
Yes. But Spinoza ultimately concluded that these weren't two separate substances. He argued they were just two attributes, or aspects, of the same single substance.
One substance. What was it?
He famously called it deus sive natura, God or nature. For him, they were identical.
So God is nature.
In essence, yes. And flowing from that, he argued that our mental perception of bodies and the physical bodies themselves are actually one and the same thing, just viewed from different perspectives. The idea and the thing are one.
So for Spinoza, the thought of a table and the actual table, they're just two ways of experiencing the same underlying reality, not separate things interacting.
That's the core of it. However, the sources critique Spinoza for not really providing enough justification for this huge claim.
How so?
Well, just because mind, the presenting, and the world, the presented, might share some fundamental nature, it doesn't automatically bridge the gap to an independent, objective reality. The question still lingers. How do we know our representations match something existing on its own?
Right, the link isn't proven.
The sources argue Spinoza basically puts extinction space entirely within our presentment, our perception, rather than making it a property of an independent reality.
That's a really important distinction. And the sources also touch on Spinoza's understanding of will. How did that fit in?
Yes, for Spinoza, will isn't some separate faculty. It's considered a modus cogitendi, a mode of thinking. It's basically equated with judgment or affirmation.
So, just another kind of thought.
Pretty much. This contrasts sharply with Schopenhauer later, where will becomes the fundamental real thing itself.
A big difference.
Huge. The sources also point out, maybe a bit critically, Spinoza's tendency to use common words like God, justice, will, in very specific, sometimes unconventional ways, which can cause confusion.
Redefining terms.
Right. But to be fair, the text does credit Spinoza with implicitly recognizing a distinction between phenomena and how things appear to us, and the thing in itself, how they are independently. That's a key idea that Kant really runs with later.
Okay, so we've seen these attempts. Malebranche with God pulling the strings, Leibniz with his synchronized clocks, and Spinoza with his unified substance. Now we arrive at Berkeley, who the sources call the originator of proper and true idealism. What made his approach so distinct, so idealistic.
George Berkeley took a truly radical step. He argued that the perceivable world, chairs, trees, mountains, anything extended in space, exists only as a presentment in our minds, or in some minds.
Only in the mind, so no physical world out there at all.
For Berkeley, it's illogical, even contradictory, to say that matter could exist outside of all perception, completely independent of any knowing subject. His famous line is esse est percipi.
Is to be perceived.
Exactly. If something isn't being perceived by some mind, it simply doesn't exist in the way we think of physical objects existing.
Wow. So for Berkeley, if no one is around to see the proverbial tree fall in the forest...
It literally doesn't exist as a physical event or object unless it's being perceived. Now, Berkeley brings God back in here, too.
How so?
He believed that true existence belongs only to knowing and willing beings, spirits, he called them. That includes us, and crucially, God. For Berkeley, God's will and omnipotence are the direct and immediate causes of the consistent presentments, the perceptions we experience. God is constantly perceiving everything, which gives the world its continuity.
Okay, so God's perception keeps reality stable.
That's the idea. It's a significant departure from the realist views we've discussed. Reality is fundamentally mental.
That's definitely a major shift. Now, the sources introduced John Locke, who adopted a very different, more experience-based approach. More common sense, perhaps.
Yes, Locke, heavily influenced by empiricists like Bacon and Hobbes, really grounded his philosophy in observation and what seemed like common understanding. Unlike the rationalists we've discussed, Locke firmly believed that matter is real.
So, back to a real physical world.
Definitely. And he thought physical interaction does occur between matter and the knowing subject, us. He even, interestingly, considered the possibility that thinking substance itself might just be a highly organized form of matter.
So Locke was a strong proponent of an external material world causing our perceptions, a realist.
Absolutely. Locke proposed that matter generates presentments, the ideal in our minds, through impulse or direct physical contact. The sources call this massive realism.
Okay, straightforward enough, but there was a catch, right? Something Berkeley jumped on.
Yes. A crucial point of contention was Locke's assertion about primary qualities.
Primary qualities, like...
Things like solidity, extension, size, shape, figure, motion or rest, and number. Locke believed these qualities would exist in objects whether or not any conscious beings were there to perceive them. They were inherent to the objects.
Ah, so he thought those aspects were truly objective, unlike, say, color or taste.
Precisely. And Berkeley challenged that, arguing that even those supposedly objective qualities like shape or size are still dependent on being perceived. You can't imagine shape without some kind of perception of it.
That makes sense. So Locke threw this line.
Yes. He distinguished between these primary qualities, which he believed were inherent in things and accurately copied in our minds, and secondary qualities.
Like color, sound, taste.
Exactly. Those, Locke thought, were just the powers in objects, arising from the primary qualities, to produce sensations in us. They don't resemble anything in the object itself. The sensation of red isn't like the surface properties causing it.
Okay, so primary qualities are copies, secondary are effects.
Right. And the sources point out that Schopenhauer found Locke's idea that our conceptions of primary qualities are true copies of external reality to be a kind of reductio ad absurdum of realism. It seemed naive.
Like, how could our mental idea perfectly copy a physical thing?
Exactly. Plus, Locke didn't fully explain why only those specific primary qualities should be considered purely objective.
And this distinction Locke made between primary and secondary qualities, the sources say, is the precursor to something important later, a foundation for Kant.
Yes, Locke's distinction is identified as the origin, or at least the key ancestor, of the later, much more developed Kantian distinction between the thing in itself and the phenomena.
Which brings us neatly to Kant. The sources mention that Hume's skepticism played a key role in his thinking. What was Kant's major insight here?
Right. Immanuel Kant. He famously said that David Hume's skepticism, especially about causality, can we really know that one thing causes another just from experience, awoke him from his dogmatic slumber.
Shook things up for him.
Big time. Kant's groundbreaking insight was that fundamental concepts like space, time, and causality are not derived from experience, as Locke and Hume thought. Instead, they are known a priori.
A priori.
Meaning they exist in us as structures of our own minds before any specific experience. Think of them like the operating system of the mind, necessary to process any incoming data from the senses.
So they're like mental frameworks.
Exactly. They belong to the subjective side of knowledge. They're how we organize experience.
So for Kant, These aren't characteristics of the external world itself, but rather the way our minds necessarily structure our experiences.
Precisely. And this has a huge implication for Locke's primary qualities.
Because
Qualities like extension, motion, shape, they're all defined using determinations of time, space, and causality. If time, space, and causality are subjective frameworks,
then those primary qualities must also be subjective, part of how we perceive, not how things are in themselves.
you've got it. They belong to our way of knowing them. They are part of the ideal, the phenomenon, not the real, the thing in itself.
So the consequence is we never actually know things as they truly are, only as they appear to us.
That's the core of Kant's conclusion. We only know phenomena, appearances, shaped by the inherent structure of our minds. The real, the thing itself, or noumenon, remains ultimately unknowable to our theoretical reason. It's that mere X, as the sources put it.
So the world we perceive is ideal, a presentment, but it's somehow connected to this unknown real.
Exactly. Kant essentially showed that even the seemingly most objective qualities, the ones Locke thought were out there, actually have a subjective origin, rooted in the functions of our own understanding, maybe even our brains, as the sources hint.
Okay, we've reached Kant, a major turning point. Now, how does Schopenhauer build upon this complex framework? The sources mention he takes a final step. What was that?
Schopenhauer deeply admired Kant, especially his distinction between phenomenon and thing in itself. He saw it as crucial, but he felt Kant hadn't gone quite far enough in identifying what that thing in itself might be.
Kant left it as an unknown X.
Right. Schopenhauer takes what he considers the decisive final step. He argues that the absolute real, the thing in itself, can never be given to us directly as a presentment, an object of perception, because presentment is inherently ideal, inherently phenomenal.
Okay, so if we can't access this real through our perceptions or thoughts about objects, how do we gain any knowledge of it at all? Where do we look?
Schopenhauer's brilliant, or at least crucial, move is to say, look within. Since we ourselves are undeniably real beings, part of this reality, the knowledge of the real, must somehow be accessible from inside our own nature.
Inside ourselves?
And what he identifies as this immediate, non-phenomenal manifestation of the real within our own consciousness is will.
Will, like making choices.
Not just conscious decision-making, though that's part of this manifestation. For Schopenhauer, will is much broader, deeper. It's the fundamental, often unconscious driving force, the striving, the energy that underlies all of reality, including our own bodies and actions. It's the inner essence of everything.
Wow, that's a significant reorientation. So for Schopenhauer, everything we perceive our bodies, the space around us, time, cause and effect, even what Spinoza called extended substance or Locke called matter, all of that belongs to the ideal. The world is presentment, as appearance.
The entire perceivable, objectively presented world is phenomenon, is ideal.
And the real.
The real, the thing in itself behind all these appearances, is always will.
So he completely flips it from some earlier thinkers who saw will as part of thought, part of the ideal.
Precisely. He argues that only the will remains as the truly real. And this, as the sources note, has massive implications for his ethics, where understanding and dealing with this relentless will becomes central.
So the fundamental distinction, the ultimate opposition for Schopenhauer, is between will and presentment.
That's it. The presented thing and the presentment are the same, ideal. But the underlying reality, the thing in itself, is always will, no matter how it appears in our perception.
That's a very clear, if startling, conclusion. Now, the sources include a rather strong and critical perspective on the post-Kantian philosophers. Fichte, Schelling, Hegel. It doesn't sound very flattering at all.
That's putting it mildly. Schopenhauer essentially dismisses them, arguing they aren't genuine philosophers in the same vein as Kant or Locke or even Plato.
Not genuine.
Right. He accuses them, quite bluntly, of lacking sincerity and intellectual honesty. He calls them mere sophists, more concerned with academic careers, personal fame, and impressing the public or the state than with the earnest pursuit of truth.
Ouch. So he thought they were just playing intellectual games.
Pretty much. He criticizes their methods as deceptive, their language as deliberately obscure and pretentious, designed to awe rather than clarify, and their core ideas as fundamentally flawed, even nonsensical at times.
He really doesn't hold back, does he? What specifically did he object to in their philosophies? Any examples?
Well, he criticizes Fichte for basically saying there's nothing behind our presentments, just the I positing the not I, effectively abolishing the thing in itself.
Getting rid of the real altogether.
Yes. He takes issue with Schelling's idea of an absolute identity of the real and ideal, which Schopenhauer saw as just muddling the crucial distinctions Kant had made.
Blurring the lines.
Exactly. And he reserves particular scorn for Hegel, especially Hegel's notion that rational thought itself is identical to the ultimate nature of reality, that the real is rational and the rational is real. Schopenhauer found this utterly absurd.
So he thought they were constructing these grand systems without a solid foundation in honest investigation.
That's his view. He felt they were using philosophy for ulterior motives, serving personal ambition rather than truth, unlike the earlier thinkers who, even if wrong, were engaged in what he saw as a more honest struggle with the deep problems.
It sounds like Schopenhauer viewed their work as a serious wrong turn after Kant, a deviation from genuine philosophy.
Precisely. He contrasts their approach very sharply with the rigorous investigations of thinkers like Locke, Berkeley, Hume, and especially Kant, whom he saw as his true philosophical predecessors.
Well, that's certainly a forceful note to end that section on. It really highlights just how seriously Schopenhauer took this whole question of the ideal and the real and how convinced he was of his own answer.
Indeed. It underscores his deep conviction that his own identification of will as the thing in itself offered the most accurate and honest resolution to this centuries-old philosophical puzzle.
So to bring our own deep dive to a close, we've traced a really long and pretty intricate path through philosophical history. We started with Descartes' fundamental questions about what we can know, about reality itself.
Yeah, and we looked at all these different attempts to figure out the relationship between what's in our minds, the ideal, and what might exist independently, the real.
Yeah.
From, theological explanations to these really elaborate metaphysical systems.
Right, through Malebranche, Leibniz, Spinoza, Berkeley's radical idealism, Locke's realism.
Culminating in Kant's critical philosophy, setting the stage for Schopenhauer's big move, identifying will as the underlying reality of everything we experience.
And that fundamental tension remains, doesn't it? The subjective nature of our experience versus the persistent question of an objective, independent reality. How much is us? How much is out there?
It's the perennial question, really. How much of the world we know is a construction, shaped by our own minds, and how much exists completely apart from our perception?
It's definitely a question that continues to provoke thought. And on that note, maybe something for you, the listener, to consider. How might Schopenhauer's concept of will as the fundamental reality change your understanding of your own actions, your desires, the world around you?
Yeah, if everything we perceive is ultimately just a manifestation of this underlying striving force,
Yeah.
what are the implications? How does that affect how we see ourselves, our motivations, our place in the universe?
Is it all just will expressing itself through the lens of presentment? Definitely something to continue pondering long after this deep dive ends.
We encourage you to keep exploring these fascinating ideas and maybe to reflect a bit more consciously on the nature of reality as you experience it day to day.